If you're in the photo, you're next. Chapter 1. The find at the market. Evan weaved through the flea market's crowded aisles, the air thick with dust and chatter, vendors hawking trinkets, kids darting past with sticky hands, the sun glaring overhead. His Saturday ritual was simple. Hunt for oddities to clutter his apartment, a one-bedroom haven of mismatched lamps and vinyl records. Today, a battered table caught his eye. Piles of junk, chipped mugs, a wind-up toy frog. Then he saw it. An old camera, black and boxy, its leather strap frayed, lens scratched but intact. A faded price tag read, $5 works. Deal, he muttered, handing over a crumpled bill to the vendor. A grizzled guy with a beard like steel wool. Careful with that one, the man rasped, eyes glinting oddly. Takes more than you think. Evan smirked. Cryptic sales pitch, classic flea market vibe. He tucked the camera under his arm, already picturing it on his shelf, and headed home. In his cluttered living room, he popped open the back, film still inside, half used. Score, he said, grinning, and wound it up, snapping a test shot of his record player. The shutter clicked, a satisfying snap. Curiosity tugged. He had a friend with a dark room. Why not develop it? An hour later, he dropped the film off at Mia's place, her basement a tangle of trays and chemicals. Old school, she teased, but promised prints by tomorrow. Sunday morning, Evan grabbed the envelope from Mia, thick, heavy with photos. He sprawled on his couch, flipping through. First, blank frames, then strangers. A woman in a yellow dress, frozen mid-scream, eyes wide. A kid with a soccer ball, mouth open in terror. An old man, hands raised, face pale, all staring off camera, scared stiff. What the? He muttered, pulse ticking up. These weren't his. Last photo, his record player, clear as day, but behind it, a faint blur, tall and dark, like a shadow smudged into the frame. Evan squinted. Nothing was there when he'd snapped it. Mia's note read, "Weird roll. Where'd you get this?" He grabbed the camera, turning it over. No brand, just scratches and that lens, glinting oddly in the light. Chapter 2. Picture that. Liz Evans' living room felt tighter. The envelope of photos spread across his coffee table like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Strangers in terrified poses, eyes locked on something unseen, and his own shot of the record player, with that blurry shadow lurking behind. The old camera sat on the shelf, its scratched lens catching the afternoon sun, glinting like it watched him back. Creepy, he muttered, flipping through again. The woman in yellow, the kid, the old man, all frozen, all wrong. He texted Mia. "These pics are nuts. Where'd they come from?" She replied fast. "The film, dude. Old stock, maybe leftovers." Evan frowned. Leftovers didn't explain the fear, the shadow. He grabbed the camera, winding the film, still some left, and aimed at his kitchen counter. Mugs, a cereal box, normal stuff. Snap. The shutter clicked, smooth and sharp. "Let's see," he said, dropping it off at Mia's again, curiosity outweighing the unease prickling his spine. Monday evening, he picked up the new prints. Mia handed them over, brow furrowed. "You're gonna love this," she said, voice dry. Back home, he tore open the envelope. First shot, his counter, mugs in place. But there he was, Evan, standing behind it, wearing a red jacket he didn't own, his face blank, staring off to the side. "No way," he whispered, heart thudding. He'd been alone, no mirror, no trick. Next photo, same counter, but Evan again, this time in a blue shirt, eyes wide, mouth tight, like he'd seen something awful. He flipped. Another, Evan in a gray hoodie, hands clenched, staring straight at the camera, expression cold. "I didn't take these," he muttered, checking the camera. No timer, no settings, just film and a lens. The last shot. His counter. Empty. No Evan, but that blurry shadow stood taller, sharper, its edges hinting at a coat, arms faint but reaching. Evan's phone buzzed. "Mia. You posing weird or what? These are freaky." He stared at the camera. Its lens glinted, almost alive. "What are you showing me?" he whispered, the photos trembling in his hands, each one a lie he couldn't unsee, pulling him deeper into its frame. Chapter 3. The Hoi. Faces that haunt Evan's apartment buzzed with unease. The new photos scattered on his coffee table. Him in clothes he didn't own, staring with expressions he didn't make, and that blurry shadow growing sharper in the last shot. The old camera sat on the shelf, its lens catching the dim light of his lamp, glinting like an eye that wouldn't blink. The first batch, those strangers in terror, mixed with these, a gallery of fear he couldn't explain. "This isn't right," he muttered, pacing, the hardwood creaking under his sneakers. He grabbed his phone, texting Mia. "Camera's messed up. I'm in pics I didn't take." She fired back. "Selfies without a timer? Wild. Bring it over." Evan hesitated. The lens glinted again, pulling him in, but stuffed it in his bag and headed to her place. The dark room hummed, chemical tang stinging his nose as Mia loaded fresh film. "Test it," she said, handing it back. Evan aimed at her cluttered desk. Pens, a soda can, snap. The shutter clicked, clean and crisp. Wednesday. Morning. He grabbed the prints. Mia's grin was tight. "You're not gonna like this." Back home, he ripped open the envelope. First shot, her desk, but there he was, Evan, in a black coat, standing behind, eyes hollow, mouth a grim line, staring off frame. "No," he whispered, flipping. Another. Evan in a green shirt, hands raised, face twisted in panic, like he'd seen a ghost. Third. Evan in a white tee, staring at the camera, expression blank, unblinking. Last shot, the desk, empty, but the shadow loomed, tall, its coat clear, arms reaching faintly, sharper than ever. Evan's pulse raced. These weren't him. Couldn't be. He'd stood alone, snapping Mia's desk. He checked the camera, film still in, half used. "What's doing this?" he muttered, turning it over. No markings, just that lens, glinting like it knew him. His phone buzzed. "Mia. You didn't pose, right? This is creepy as heck." He stared at the photos. Strangers, him, the shadow, all tied to this thing. Each shot a step closer to something he couldn't name, the camera's gaze pulling him in deeper. Chapter 4. The lens watches. Back Evan's living room buzzed with tension. The latest photos scattered across his coffee table. Mia's desk clear, but him in every shot, wearing clothes he didn't own, staring with hollow eyes, panicked hands, blank faces, and that shadow looming sharper in the last frame. The old camera sat on the shelf, its scratched lens glinting in the lamplight, a silent sentinel over his growing pile of prints. Strangers in terror, him in impossible poses. The hardwood creaked as he paced, the air thick with the faint scent of rain seeping through his cracked window from yesterday's storm. "This isn't me," he muttered, flipping through again. The woman in yellow screaming, the kid with the soccer ball frozen, him in a black coat staring off frame. He grabbed his phone, texting Mia. "Need you to see this. It's getting worse." She replied fast. "On my way. That camera's freaky." Evan clutched it, winding the film, still some left, and aimed at his bookshelf. Records, a cactus, normal stuff. Snap. The shutter clicked, sharp and final. "Let's see what you do now," he said, dropping it off at Mia's darkroom again. Thursday? Afternoon, he grabbed the prints. Mia's face was pale. You're not going to believe this. Back home, he tore open the envelope. First shot, his bookshelf. But there he was, Evan, in a brown jacket, standing behind, eyes wide, mouth open like mid-shout, staring off to the left. No way, he whispered, flipping. Another. Evan. In a purple shirt, hands clutching his face, terror etched deep, gazing upward. Third. Evan in a denim jacket, staring at the camera, face cold, lips tight. Last shot, the bookshelf, empty, but the shadow stood tall, its coat crisp, arms stretching longer, fingers faintly curled, edges too real. Evan's heart thudded. These weren't him. He'd stood alone, snapping the shelf. He checked the camera. No tricks, just film and that lens, glinting like it saw through him. His phone buzzed. Mia. You didn't move, right? This is insane. He stared at the prints. Each stranger's fear, each version of him, the shadow's creep, tied to this thing. What are you? He whispered, the lens catching the light, the photos trembling in his hands, pulling him deeper into its gaze. Chapter 5. The past creeps. In Evan's apartment hummed with unease. The new photos sprawled across his coffee table, his bookshelf clear, but him in every frame, in stranger's clothes, shouting, terrified, cold, and that shadow stretching taller, sharper in the last shot. The old camera sat on the shelf, its lens glinting like a predator's eye, overseeing the growing pile. Strangers frozen in fear, him in impossible moments. The air felt heavy, the faint drip of rain from the cracked window, a rhythm to his pacing, the hardwood groaning under his restless steps. He grabbed his phone, texting Mia. This isn't stopping. Help me figure it out. She fired back. Be there soon. Bring the camera. Evan hesitated. The lens glinted again, pulling. Him, but stuffed it in his bag and met her at her place. The dark room smelled of chemicals, Mia's hands steady as she loaded fresh film. One more, she said, voice tight. Evan aimed at her living room, couch, TV, a potted plant. Snap. The shutter clicked, smooth and ominous. Let's see, he muttered, leaving it with her. Friday morning, he grabbed the prints. Mia's eyes were wide. This is next level creepy. Back home, he ripped open the envelope. First shot, her couch, but there he was. Evan, in a striped sweater standing behind, eyes bulging, mouth twisted in a silent scream, staring off frame. No, he whispered, flipping. Another. Evan in a leather jacket, hands raised like shielding himself, face pale with dread, gazing up. Third. Evan in a plaid shirt, staring at the camera, expression blank, unblinking, cold. Last shot, the couch, empty, but the shadow loomed, its coat stark, arms long and thin, fingers curling toward the lens, its edges crisp, almost solid. Evan's breath caught. These weren't him. He'd stood alone, snapping Mia's room. He flipped to the first batch, the woman in yellow, the kid, the old man, all terrified, all staring at something. It's the same, he muttered, pulse racing. The shadow tied them all. His phone buzzed. Mia. You didn't pose, right? This is haunting. He stared at the camera. Its lens glinted, alive, the photos a gallery of fear pulling him in, the past creeping closer with each frame. Chapter 6. The shadow grows. Bold Evan's living room pulsed with dread. The latest photos, spread across his coffee table, Mia's couch clear, but him in every shot, screaming, shielding, blank, and that shadow looming larger, its coat crisp, fingers curling in the last frame. The old camera sat on the shelf, its lens catching the Evening light, glinting like it knew his every move, raining over the prints. Strangers in terror, him in impossible scenes. The air thickened, the drip of rain from the cracked window a steady beat. The hardwood creaking as he paced, shadows stretching long in the dim glow. He grabbed his phone, texting Mia. "It's not stopping. I need answers." She replied, "Coming over. We'll test it together." Evan clutched the camera, winding the film, still some left, and waited, the lens glinting, pulling him in. Mia arrived, her darkroom kit in tow, chemicals, trays, a determined frown. "Here," she said, setting up on his table. Evan aimed at his couch, blankets, a soda can, snap. The shutter clicked, sharp and heavy. "Develop it now," he said, voice tight, handing it over. Mia worked fast, the darkroom stink filling the room. She pulled the prints, her hands shaking. "Evan." He grabbed them. First shot, his couch, but there he was, in a tan coat standing behind, eyes, wild mouth open in a scream, staring off to the right. "No way," he whispered, flipping, another. Evan in a red hoodie, hands clawing the air, face twisted in panic, gazing up. Third, Evan in a black shirt, staring at the camera, expression cold, unblinking, hollow. Last shot, the couch, empty, but the shadow stood tall, its coat clear, arms stretching long, fingers curling toward him, its edges sharp, too real. Evan's pulse raced. These weren't him. He'd stood with Mia, snapping the shot. "It's getting closer," Mia whispered, pointing, the shadow's fingers, inches from the lens. His phone buzzed. Mia's text from earlier glowed. "This is haunting." He stared at the camera. Its lens glinted. Alive, the photos a trap tightening around him. The shadow growing bolder with each chilling frame. Chapter 7. The shadow reaches out. Evan's living room thrummed with unease. The latest photos strewn across his coffee table. His couch in sharp focus. But him in every frame, screaming, clawing, staring blankly, and that shadow looming larger. Its coat crisp, fingers curling toward the lens in the final shot. The old camera sat on the shelf, its scratched lens glinting in the dim lamplight. A silent overseer of the growing pile. Strangers frozen in terror, Evan in impossible poses. The air felt heavy. The faint drip of rain from the cracked window. A steady pulse. The hardwood creaking under his pacing feet. Shadows stretching long and jagged across the walls. Mia sat cross-legged on the floor, her darkroom gear scattered. Trays of chemicals, damp prints. Her face pale as she stared at the photos. "It's too close now," she whispered, pointing at the shadow's fingers, inches from the frame. Evan nodded, pulse racing. "One more. We need to see." She frowned, hesitant, but handed him the camera. Film still left, its lens glinting, like it dared him. He aimed at his TV, blank screen, a remote. Snap. The shutter clicked, heavy and sharp, echoing in the quiet room. Mia developed it fast, the chemical tang stinging their noses. She pulled the prints, hands trembling. "Evan, look." He grabbed them. First shot, his TV, but there he was. In a gray jacket, standing behind, eyes bulging, mouth twisted. In a scream, staring off to the left. "No," he muttered, flipping. Another. Evan in a green hoodie, hands raised in panic, face pale, gazing upward like hunted prey. Third. Evan in a dark shirt, staring at the camera, expression cold, unblinking, hollow as stone. Last shot. The TV, empty, but the shadow stood tall, its coat stark, arms long and thin, fingers stretching out, brushing the lens's edge, its form sharper, too real, too close. Evan's breath caught. "It's touching it," he said, voice trembling, showing Mia. "That's not possible," she muttered, but the photo didn't lie. The shadow's fingers grazed the frame, curling faintly. His phone buzzed. Mia's earlier text glowed. "This is haunting." He stared at the camera. Its lens glinted, alive, watching, the photos a snare tightening around him, the shadow reaching out with each chilling frame, its presence bleeding into his world. Chapter 8. The camera calls. Him Evan's apartment buzzed with dread. The new photos spread across his coffee table, his TV clear, but him in every shot, screaming, panicking, staring blankly, and that shadow in the final frame, its long fingers brushing the lens, its coat stark, its form too real. The old camera sat on the shelf, its lens catching the faint glow of his lamp, glinting like an unblinking eye over the pile. Strangers in terror, Evan in impossible scenes. The air thickened, the drip of rain from the cracked window a relentless beat, the hardwood groaning as he paced, shadows twisting across the walls like living things. Mia knelt by the table, her darkroom kit a mess. Chemicals spilled, prints, curling, her voice shaky. "It's in the shot now. Touching it. What's it want?" Evan's pulse hammered. "Us, maybe." He grabbed the camera, winding the film. Still some left, its lens pulling him in. "One more," he said, voice tight. Mia shook her head. "You're crazy," but stayed watching. He aimed at his kitchen. Counter, mugs, cereal box. Snap. The shutter clicked, a heavy thud in the silence. Mia worked the darkroom fast, her hands unsteady. She pulled the prints, gasping. "Evan!" He snatched them. First shot, his counter, but there he was, in a blue jacket standing behind, eyes wild, mouth open in a scream, staring off to the right. "No way," he whispered, flipping. Another. Evan in a brown coat, hands shielding his face, terror etched deep, gazing upward. Third. Evan in a black hoodie, staring at the camera, expression blank, cold, unblinking, like a shell. Last shot, the counter, empty, but the shadow loomed, its coat clear, arms stretched long, fingers curling around the lens, its edges solid, its form pressing closer, too vivid. Evan's knees wobbled. "It's holding it," he said, voice trembling, showing Mia. "That's not just a shadow," she muttered, pointing. Its fingers gripped the frame, faint lines hinting at knuckles. His phone buzzed. Mia's text glowed. "This is haunting." He stared at the camera. Its lens glinted, alive, calling. The photos a trap snapping shut, the shadow's reach growing bolder, its gaze locking him in with each frame. Chapter 9. The frame traps. Him Evan's living room pulsed with fear, the latest photos strewn across his coffee table, his kitchen counter sharp, but him in every shot, screaming, shielding, blank, and that shadow in the final frame, its fingers curling around the lens, its coat stark, its form pressing too close. The old camera sat on the shelf, its lens glinting in the lamplight, a silent predator over the growing pile. Strangers in terror, Evan in impossible moments. The air felt dense, the drip of rain from the cracked window a steady rhythm, the hardwood creaking as he paced, shadows stretching long and dark across the room. Mia sat on the couch, her darkroom gear scattered, trays tipped, prints damp, her face pale. "It's grabbing the lens, Evan, it's in it." He nodded, heart racing. "We need to know how far." She frowned. "You're pushing it," but handed him the camera, film still left, its lens glinting like it waited. He aimed at his bookshelf again, records, cactus, snap. The shutter clicked, a heavy snap that lingered in the quiet. Mia developed it quick, her hands shaking. She pulled the prints, voice cracking. "Look at this." Evan grabbed them. First shot, his bookshelf. But there he was, in a striped shirt, standing behind, eyes bulging, mouth twisted in a scream, staring off to the left. "No," he muttered, flipping. Another. Evan in a red jacket, hands clawing the air, face pale with dread, gazing upward. Third. Evan in a gray hoodie, staring at the camera, expression cold, unblinking, hollow as death. Last shot. The bookshelf. Empty. But the shadow stood. Its coat vivid, arms stretched long, fingers wrapping the lens's edge, its form solid, a faint blur where a face might be, pressing into his world. Evan's breath hitched. "It's almost here," he said, voice trembling, showing Mia. "That's not just touching. It's holding it," she whispered, pointing. Its fingers gripped, knuckles faintly visible. His phone buzzed. Mia's text glowed. "This is haunting." He stared at the camera. Its lens glinted, alive, hungry. The photo's a snare closing tight, the shadow trapping him frame by frame, its reach a promise he couldn't escape. Chapter 10. The Shadow's Hold. Tightens Evan's living room thrummed with dread. The latest photos scattered across his coffee table. His bookshelf in focus, but him in every shot, screaming, clawing, staring blankly, and that shadow in the final frame. Its fingers wrapping the lens's edge, its coat vivid, its form pressing. Too close. The old camera sat on the shelf, its scratched lens glinting in the dim glow of his lamp, a silent captor over the growing pile. Strangers frozen in terror. Evan trapped in impossible scenes. The air grew heavy, the drip of rain from the cracked window a steady pulse, the hardwood creaking under his pacing feet, shadows stretching long and jagged across the walls like living things. Mia perched on the couch, her darkroom gear a chaotic sprawl, chemical trays tipped, prints curling at the edges, her voice shaky. "It's holding the lens, Evan. Look at its grip." He nodded, heart pounding. "It's not stopping." She frowned, eyes wide. "We should ditch it." But Evan clutched the camera, winding the film. Still some left, its lens glinting like a challenge. "One more," he said, voice tight, aiming at his TV again. Blank screen, remote, snap. The shutter clicked, a heavy thud echoing in the stillness. Mia worked fast in the makeshift darkroom, her hands trembling as the chemical tang filled the room. She pulled the prints, gasping. "Evan, it's worse." He snatched them. First. Shot. His TV. But there he was, in a navy jacket, standing behind, eyes wild, mouth twisted in a scream, staring off to the right. "No way," he whispered, flipping. Another. Evan in a yellow shirt, hands raised in panic, face pale with dread, gazing upward like cornered prey. Third. Evan in a dark coat, staring at the camera, expression blank, cold, unblinking, hollow as a void. Last shot. The TV, empty, but the shadow loomed. Its coat stark, arms stretched long, fingers curling tighter around the lens, its edges solid. A faint blur where a face might form, pressing closer. Too real. Evan's breath hitched. "It's squeezing it," he said, voice trembling, showing Mia. "That's not just holding. It's claiming it," she muttered, pointing. Its fingers gripped hard, faint wrinkles hinting at flesh. His phone buzzed. Mia's text glowed. "This is haunting." He stared at the camera. Its lens glinted, alive, possessive, the photos a trap snapping shut, the shadow's hold tightening with each chilling frame, its reach bleeding into his reality. Chapter 11. The lens pulls. Closer. Evan's apartment pulsed. With fear, the new photos spread across his coffee table. His TV clear. but him in every shot, screaming, panicking, blank, and that shadow in the final frame, its fingers curling tighter around the lens, its coat stark, its form too vivid, too near. The old camera sat on the shelf, its lens catching the fading light of his lamp, glinting like a hunter's eye over the pile. Strangers in terror, Evan in impossible moments. The air thickened, the drip of rain from the cracked window a relentless beat, the hardwood groaning as he paced, shadows twisting across the room like they moved with intent. Mia sat on the floor, her darkroom kit a mess, chemicals splashed, prints damp, her voice quivering. "It's not just in the photo, it's on it, Evan." He nodded, pulse racing. "It's getting stronger." She gripped the table. "We should break it." But Evan shook his head, winding the film, still some left, its lens pulling him in. "One more. We need to know." She sighed, reluctant, but stayed as he aimed at his kitchen again. Counter, mugs, snap. The shutter clicked, a sharp snap that lingered in the quiet. Mia developed it quick, her hands unsteady as the darkroom stink stung their noses. She pulled the prints, voice cracking. "Look at this." Evan grabbed them. First shot, his counter. But there he was, in a tan sweater standing behind, eyes bulging, mouth open in a scream, staring off to the left. "No," he muttered, flipping, another. Evan in a purple jacket, hands clawing the air, face twisted in dread, gazing upward like trapped prey. Third, Evan in a gray shirt, staring at the camera, expression blank, unblinking, cold as ice. Last shot, the counter, empty. But the shadow stood, its coat vivid, arms stretched long, fingers wrapping the lens tighter, its edges solid, a faint outline of a head blurring into view, pressing closer, too real, too alive. Evan's knees wobbled. "It's almost through," he said, voice trembling, showing Mia. "That's not just a grip. It's pushing," she whispered, pointing. Its fingers pressed, faint lines hinting at a palm. His phone buzzed. Mia's text glowed. "This is haunting." He stared at the camera. Its lens glinted, alive, hungry. The photos a snare closing fast, the shadow pulling him in with each frame, its presence a step from breaking free. Chapter 12. The shadows edge Evan's living room buzzed with panic. The latest photos sprawled across his coffee table. His kitchen counter sharp, but him in every shot, screaming, clawing, blank, and that shadow in the final frame. Its fingers wrapping the lens tighter, its coat vivid, a faint head blurring into view, too close, too real. The old camera sat on the shelf, its lens glinting. In the dim light, a silent tyrant over the pile, strangers in terror, Evan in impossible poses. The air grew dense, the drip of rain from the cracked window a steady rhythm, the hardwood creaking as he paced, shadows stretching long and dark, shifting like they lived. Mia knelt by the table, her darkroom gear scattered, trays overturned, prints curling, her voice trembling. "It's not just holding. It's coming through, Evan." He nodded, heart thudding. "We've got to see how far." She shook her head. "You're insane," but stayed, watching as he wound the film, still some left, its lens glinting like a dare. He aimed at his couch again, blankets, soda can, snap. The shutter clicked, a heavy thud that hung in the stillness. Mia worked the darkroom fast, her hands shaking as the chemical tang filled the room. She pulled the prints, voice breaking. "Evan, it's bad." He snatched them, first shot, his couch. But there he was, in a green coat, standing behind, eyes wild, mouth twisted in a scream, staring off to the right. "No way," he whispered, flipping. Another. Evan in a blue hoodie, hands raised in panic, face pale with dread, gazing upward like doomed prey. Third, Evan in a dark jacket, staring at the camera, expression blank, unblinking, cold as death. Last shot. The couch, empty, but the shadow loomed, its coat stark, arms stretched long, fingers gripping the lens hard, its head blurring clearer, faint hollows where eyes might be, pressing against the frame, too alive. Evan's breath caught. "It's breaking it," he said, voice trembling, showing Mia. "That's not just pushing, it's here," she muttered, pointing. Its fingers squeezed, faint knuckles stark. His phone buzzed. Mia's text glowed. "This is haunting." He stared at the camera. Its lens glinted, alive, relentless, the photos a trap snapping shut, the shadow's edge cutting closer with each frame, its presence a breath from his world. Chapter 13. The shadow breaks. Free Evan's living room pulsed with dread, the latest photos strewn across his coffee table, his couch in sharp focus, but him in every shot, screaming, panicking, blank. And that shadow in the final frame, its fingers gripping the lens hard, its coat stark, a faint head, with hollow eye-like blur pressing against the edge, too vivid, too close. The old camera sat on the shelf, its scratched lens glinting in the dim lamplight, a silent predator reigning over the pile. Strangers frozen in terror, Evan trapped in impossible scenes. The air thickened, the drip of rain from the cracked window a relentless beat, the hardwood groaning as he paced, shadows writhing across the walls like they breathed. Mia sat hunched on the floor, her darkroom gear a wreck, chemical trays spilled, prints curling, her voice trembling. "It's breaking through, Evan. Look at its head." He nodded, heart pounding. "One last shot. We end this." She shook her head. "You're nuts." But stayed, hands clenched as he wound the film. Still a frame left, its lens glinting, like a dare. He aimed at his TV once more. Blank screen, remote, snap. The shutter clicked, a heavy thud that shook the room, the air tightening around them. Mia worked the darkroom fast, her hands shaking as the chemical stench stung their noses. She pulled the prints, voice cracking. "Evan, it's..." He grabbed them. First shot. His TV. But there he was, in a gray coat, standing behind, eyes wild, mouth twisted in a scream, staring off to the left. "No," he muttered, flipping. Another. Evan in a red shirt, hands clawing the air, face pale with dread, gazing upward like trapped prey. Third. Evan in a black hoodie, staring at the camera, expression blank, unblinking, cold as stone. Then gone, a blank space where he'd been, the shadow stepping in, its coat vivid, arms stretched, fingers curling. Last shot, the TV, empty, but the shadow filled it, its coat stark, arms long, fingers gripping the lens's edge, its head clear. Hollow eyes, jagged mouth curling, staring straight out, breaking through the frame entirely. Evan's breath stopped. "It's free," he whispered, dropping the photo, hands trembling. "That's not just in it, it's out," Mia said, voice breaking, pointing. Its hollow eyes glinted, its jagged mouth wide. His phone buzzed. Mia's text glowed. "This is haunting." He stared at the camera. Its lens flared, alive. The photos a trap snapping shut. The shadow's form stepping closer, its presence flooding the room as the air grew cold. Chapter 14. The next frame. Waits Evan's apartment drowned in silence, the final photos trembling on his coffee table. His TV clear, but him erased, the shadow breaking through, its hollow eyes and jagged mouth staring out, its coat stark, fingers gripping. The lens, its form spilling from the frame into his world. The old camera sat on the shelf, its lens glinting in the dim light, a silent victor over the pile. Strangers in terror. Evan's vanishing act. The air froze. The drip of rain from the cracked window a faint echo. The hardwood still as he stood. Heart thudding, shadows pooling thick and dark around him. Mia clutched the couch, her darkroom gear scattered, chemicals dried, prints curling, her voice a whisper. "Evan, it's not in the photo. It's here." He nodded, pulse racing. The shadow's presence pressed against him. Cold, heavy, real. "We've got to," he started, but the camera clicked. Snap, unprompted, a heavy thud that jolted them both. "No!" Mia gasped, lunging for it. Evan grabbed it first, popping the back. Film gone, the roll empty. He turned. The room was empty, but the air shifted, a faint hiss brushing his ear, cold and alive. His phone buzzed. Blank screen, then a photo loaded. Mia by the couch, eyes wide, mouth open in a scream, staring off frame. Him gone. A blank space where he'd stood, the shadow looming behind her, its hollow eyes glinting, jagged mouth curling, wider, fingers curling toward her. "Evan?" she whispered, turning. He was there, solid, but the photo didn't lie. Another buzz, the shadow alone, holding a frame with his blurred face, its hollow eyes staring out, waiting. "Destroy it!" Mia yelled. Grabbing a lamp, Evan swung at the camera. It hit the floor, cracking, but the lens glinted, unbroken, alive. The hiss grew. His neck, his ear. Cold. Pressing. The room stilled. Then the camera clicked again. Snap. From the floor. Untouched. Evan froze, the shadows chill on his skin, his phone glowing. Next. The air thickened. Mia's breath hitched, and the flea market's echo lingered. Someone new would find it. The shadow's frame ready, its next shot waiting as Evan's world faded into the dark.